Hello, and welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about things that I think we need to talk about. Today, we need to talk about Nazis. Now, in the background, I have playing a Walt Disney cartoon from 1943, I believe, called Education for Death, as you can see, and it's based on a book that was written by an American author. Just turn down the volume there. And it became a source of imagery about the Nazi state, as you can see. And, obviously it's based on reality, but of course it is propaganda and it is created for effect, not to educate so much as to impel people. So it's a very partial story, and the reality of life under Nazi rule in Germany was that um, the it was kept as normal as possible for people. It didn't. Hitler was obsessed with making sure that the home front during the war didn't feel like it was at war, because he felt that that was a big part of what caused um, the failure of morale, leading to the stab in the back that lost them World War One, even though they'd won militarily. But according to him, of course, that isn't true. But that was the way he and a lot of Germans saw the end of World War One. So this imagery becomes a kind of way of looking at Nazis in a kind of absolute sense, and almost becomes a straw Nazi. We'll see that it actually works alongside um, uh, more academic visions of what Nazism meant to create an idea of Nazism that was um, uh, largely fictitious and made it hard for people who follow those particular forms of reasoning to see uh, Nazi traits in themselves. And I think this is actually was a key start to what has been an 80-year long program of moving more and more towards becoming Nazi-like in our um, in our so-called Western liberal polities. So the one of the things I think that um, we should bear in mind is that people shift as the values of uh, Nazism become more prominent, and the more normal people become Nazis as they go along. So, asked what she thought was the greatest lesson of the Holocaust, Susan Sontag replied that she thought 10% of any population is cruel no matter what, and 10% is merciful no matter what, and the remaining 80% can be moved in either direction. And it is really the shifting of that 80% that is a big part of what made Nazism at its height. Um, now, so this is really the story of our transformation into increasingly Nazi-like uh, polities. And obviously, if anyone doubts that, I'll give evidence for why I say that later on. But, we're not Nazis. We are kind of Nazi adjacent, or Nazi-ish, or Nazistic, or Nazi-esque, or Nazistisch. Maybe that's the best word for it, Nazi-stisch. Um, and why do I use that term and not fascist? I mean, I often use the term fascist to describe what's going on because I want to draw attention to something. Well, I'm using Nazi for the same reason here. Nazi-ness has been constructed as the epitome of what not to do, of what not to be. So it is a clear moral signifier. So that means that if we are being like Nazis, we know it's wrong and it's bad and we need to stop. The problem with that is that the very nature of it being that sort of absolute thing is that then people construct it as a kind of straw man, like create an idea of an exceptional Nazism that we can't be like by definition. So they create um, create categories which we can't become, and therefore we can't ever be Nazi. So when my last one of these was the second one I did on fascism, and I said that I would be continuing it by writing an article about do androids dream of electric sheep? And I haven't done that yet, but I will. And I'm not going to go over exactly the same ground here because that is really about the Nazi individual, how someone can become a Nazi without really knowing that they have, how someone can become a murderer of children, specifically someone who murders children. Um, so I will, in fact, hopefully write that sometime soon. But yeah, I will get around to it. I promise. Anyway, the thing about the creeping sort of Nazism or creeping fascism, but again, I'm using Nazism here as my model. The thing about it is that it has been with us for a long time. The post-World War II era saw a lot of continuity of specifically Nazi thought with regard to particularly to anti-communism. But anti-communism was a way to smuggle in racial ideas as well, particularly regarding the allegedly Asiatic Russians. And there was a persistence of racialized ideas that came with that, and I would argue as well a persistence of far more fundamental racism. So, for example, the racism of is seeing yourself as a human and not seeing the other as a human. So the racism that thinks that if your government has a credible purpose, then if they happen to incinerate hundreds of thousands of children in another country because they have a plausible, because they're crusading against communism, then that's okay. You wouldn't accept that if those were children who spoke the same language as you and had the same skin color as you, but because they're not, you see them, you don't consider their sacrifice to be too much for the cause, and you're more likely to accept ideas that, in fact, you're helping them by incinerating them with your freedom bombs. So I think one of the things about Nazi-stisch, which we can, if we take the parallel of what happened in Germany, is that there is a qualitative difference in the composition of the population that would be considered Nazi, as well as a quantitative difference through time. So I did a very reductive mathematical type thing, taking steps every 5 years of degrees of Nazi Stich based on Germany. So say 19, and these are figures done for neatness, not because they're accurate. So in 1922, about 1% of the population are Nazis, and they are composed, we'll say 100% of street fighter thug types, right? So they're activists, and they are personally involved. 1927, now you've got 5% of the population are Nazis, and 25% of them are the thugs, and 75% are like outraged, frothing at the mouth gammon types. They're the sort of petty bourgeois, they hate what's happening in society, the ranting types. We are, of which we are very familiar these days. Then, say, 1932, so third degree Nazi Stich. Now we're up to, say, 25% of the country. This isn't accurate again. Just taking it mathematically, it's probably 30 odd percent. But 1932, about a quarter of the country are Nazis, 10% of the thugs, 30% of the frothing gammon types, and 60% are right-wing conservatives who just want strong leadership and stable government. And those three types are going to be the ideological core of Nazism going forward. They're going to be the enthusiasts going forward as Nazism takes over the governance of society. So you're going to be from one of those three if you're high up in the Gestapo or something like that. Then stage 4, let's say half of the country are now Nazis. I'm calling this 1937. 5% of the street thugs, 15% of the gammon, 30% of the conservatives, and 50% are nationalists. They're just loyal to Germany and to the government. They believe in government. So they're kind of a little bit authoritarian and a little bit nationalist, but very, they just be like your moderate centre-right people. Then fifth degree Nazi Stich, 1942. That's pretty much when most of that 80% Susan Sontag talked about is a Nazi. So it's just everyone apart from those who specifically risk themselves to oppose Nazism in some way. Those who actually actively oppose Nazism, the small percentage that resist, they're the only non-Nazis. And thus, we look at a book like Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men in 1992, which talks about a battalion of policemen, right? There were around 500, and they weren't Gestapo. I think they were called Order Police. I might be wrong about that. I can't remember. They were sent to the east and told to massacre Jewish people, and they're given the option of not doing so. And out of 500, about a dozen chose not to do it, and they weren't threatened with any punishment, and indeed they weren't punished. There's people didn't like what they were doing, but they obeyed and they did it. So even before Browning's Ordinary Men, some people's reaction to Nazism was to examine, instead of to exceptionalize Nazism, was to try and see what it was about that we could learn lessons from, so that we wouldn't be like that. And these people tended to concentrate on ideas of obedience to authority. So we have people like Robert J. Lifton and so forth, um, who could see in what had happened in the Holocaust. They could see lessons for us to learn about ourselves as individuals as well as society. But much more weight went into creating a sense of Nazi exceptionalism, or in the West, a particular project to try and create an idea of totalitarianism as something shared between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And of course, these concepts of positive liberty being this concept that somehow we, if you try and run society in a certain way that isn't liberal, you end up with basically horrible tyranny and millions of people being slaughtered. So the thing is that these ideas, when you exceptionalize something like that, then you stop looking for it in yourself. And I think it is fair to look at ourselves and ask how much we actually are like Nazis. I think it's fair to ask it of anyone. And if you come back with any plausible grounds for saying that someone was quite like a Nazi, and I don't mean in incidental facts, purely in terms of underlying morals, then I think it is valuable to talk about it and use it as an argument against behaviour that is overly narcissistic or narcissistisch. And we could say that, we really ought to be asking this, of Israel at the moment, and it might seem to be a bit oversensitive, but to be fair, Israelis have been calling each other Nazis for a very long time. In 1933, David Ben Gurion called Zeev Jabotinsky Vladimir Hitler. Now, Zeev was the name, he changed his name to Zeev. He was originally Vladimir. So, and to explain who Jabotinsky was, because I think it does, it is relevant to the the emergence of fascistic and Nazi ideals in Israel. He was the founder of revisionist Zionism, which was a far more overtly violent form of Zionism. He wrote a book early on called Homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man, and so forth. So he had a very kind of fascistic outlook on the world. He founded Betar, who have revived themselves or have been reconstituted recently. If you don't know who they have claimed to be behind outing pro-Palestine people to the US immigration authorities and getting them deported or arrested and thrown into horrible detention centres. They they have they have been engaged recently in some amusing but pretty alarming, really, arguments, calling the Anti-Defamation League, they're calling them anti-Semites and calling Shai Davidai an anti-Semite. Basically, they pretty much think anyone who isn't fully into the unapologetic genocide of Palestinians is an anti-Semite. And back in the 1930s, they were based in London, and EI6 described their youth organisations as being reminiscent in both their method and their ideology to the Hitler Youth movement. And one of the people who came through that was Menachem Begin, who became the leader of Irgun from 1943 to 1948, at which time Irgun became part of the IDF. But during his leadership, Irgun conducted the King David Hotel bombing, which is perhaps the most notorious, although not the most deadly, terrorist bombing conducted by Zionists, and the Deir Yassin massacre, which was the most notorious but not the most deadly massacre that happened during the Nakba. And in 1947, they hanged a couple of young British soldiers, aged 20 and 21. And I mean, this is just to indicate what their behaviour was like. And booby-trapped their bodies so that when they went to cut them down, they blew up in the faces of the British soldiers. So, not necessarily a nice guy, this Begin, but of course, if you're familiar with the name, it will be because he became the Prime Minister of Israel in 1977, leader of a party which would later become Likud. So even though up until then, people like Ben-Gurion had called such people fascists and Nazis, they became part of the mainstream in 1977. Back in 1946, a socialist, before Israel was founded, a socialist Jewish settler, an actual Zionist, said of Irgun, a Nazi is a Nazi, be he Jew or otherwise. So, even with the Holocaust very fresh in people's memories, people, including Holocaust survivors, would refer particularly to revisionist Zionists as Nazi-like. I think Victor Klemperer, who during the war, when he was in hiding in Dresden, also compared Zionism to National Socialism. So it isn't unprecedented or taboo to refer to Zionists as Nazis. There's plenty of precedent, and I think it is very intellectually profitable to look at those comparisons. So, as I said, there was an exceptionalization of Nazism, and part of that really was a project to kind of say, well, what is Nazism? It's kind of the opposite of what we are, So the starting point for some people is that these things are at the antithesis of our ideals. Therefore, because they are in the antithesis of our ideals, they're the opposite of us. But of course, we aren't our ideals. This is the problem with such constructions is that the realities of political movements, such as you know, let's call it liberalism. I mean, the greater liberalism in the greater sense of Western liberalism. They're not their ideals. They have a reality. So they created this idea of Nazis as the opposite of us, and then they also have, a not unnatural inclination to look at the things that stand out about them and create these criteria, which can be quite subjective. So, for example, fascism is often characterized, even defined, by being movements that focus on palingenesis, which is rebirth, right? And yeah, it is a striking aspect of fascists, but it's not exclusive, and it's also subjective. Many political movements reference rebirth. It's really the fact that it kind of stands out a lot with fascists is not a safe way of focusing your attention, because it will deceive you into looking for something or excluding evidence of something. So you might be like basically saying that these people aren't fascist because they don't have this and they tick all the other boxes. Or at the same time, it might be there, but you might, because it is subjective, you might actually just not see it or not count it because you're not really inclined to. Then this kind of leads to these like issues of subjectivity. And, for as someone who studied genocide a lot, subjectivity, like a little bit of subjectivity, can actually become incredibly important when it's a matter of obeying power of or your own ideology. So a small amount can be magnified, and an inch can easily turn into a mile. So, for example, the main way in which the genocidal Western powers exculpate themselves of their more recent genocidal behaviors is through intentionality. They use the intentionality as an excuse for basically we can't be committing genocide because we have no genocidal intent. Our intents are, like that we are going to do such and such else. So, and of course, in colonial pasts, this has also been true. I mean, it isn't very often that you come across genocidal entities like Germany under the Nazis who openly espouse their genocidal intent. Although I would say that that is true of Israel today, but that makes them unusual. They're certainly not exemplars in that sense, or they're exemplars of a perfection of the type that you don't normally get. So, I mean, even like these things are in the eye of the beholder a lot of the time. So we have cliches, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and so forth. Um, uh, and this kind of subjectivity can be taken to the extent where you invert the role of victim and perpetrator. So that sort of subjectivity can allow people to commit genocide in the name of preventing genocide. So, like, obviously, here we've got the claims. I have to refer to the claims that Hamas was trying to commit genocide against Israel on October the 7th, and that justifies the genocide. Well, they're not going to use the term genocide, but that justifies the what I'm calling the genocide of the Holocaust unleashed on Gaza. So this is this is such a problem that Adam Jones, who's a leading genocide scholar, wrote a book back in 2006, or he wrote Genocide: A Comprehensive Introduction, and he was making this point. And what he wrote was, quote, comedian Rob Corddry parodied this mindset in the context of US abuses and atrocities at Abu Ghraib prison near Baghdad. Quote, this is Rob Corddry now. There's no question what took place in that prison was horrible, Corddry said on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. But the Arab world has to realize that the US shouldn't be judged on the actions of we shouldn't be judged on actions. It's our principles that matter, our inspiring abstract notions. Remember, just because torturing prisons is something we did, it doesn't mean it's something we would do. End quote. So you see, this is kind of the this disconnect that is created by these categorical sort of taxonomic way of doing things, which allows these subjective things to be exploited to distance our understanding from the actual events on the ground. So, of course, if there is a particular discipline of relevance here that has a bit of a problem in this regard, it would be political science. And one of the problems is that when you are being reductionist in this way, it lends you, especially if you're qualified, it gives you a lot of authority. And that authority means that you double down, or you use a lot of insistence and conviction to make these reductionist claims that are entirely biased against reality. And I think this is a big problem. So when we have these political theory concepts, that kind of deliberately quarantine Nazism away from the possibility that it could ever be seen in another polity, particularly, of course, Western liberal polity, then you create this cadre of experts who are effectively caught up in a sort of religious belief, really, but believe that their religious knowledge, their faith, is expertise, and thus they can often override anyone who might object in some way by basically using their authority claims of being a superior in rank as a thinking person. So, however, this is you kind of, again, apart from the people like Lifton who, and the people, um, especially going into the 60s, who were looking at the problems with authoritarianism. A lot of the inclination was instead to kind of uh, to seal off Nazism, to create an exceptionalism for Nazism. But there is also like uh, another strain that got strengthened by research later on that came through. So, I mean, and I should mention here that obviously, Hannah Arendt, she clearly helped the totalitarianism discourse, although I would say that she was far more open in terms of trying to warn people about it happening in your own country, I think, like she said, you could just about swap this out for fascism instead of totalitarianism, because I don't really see much use in the term totalitarianism. But she was very, well, it was very important, her observation that the death of human empathy was a key factor here. And if we look at what is happening at the moment, I mean, we have just had this press conference, this meeting between El Salvador's President Bukele and Donald Trump, with barely concealed glee, talking about the misery they're inflicting on one particular guy who is only one of hundreds, but one who they're just like willfully and childishly condemning to suffering. And they do have a little fig leaf of pretense that that this has to do with him being part of M13, but like they're saying that this can't be, they don't need any evidence, this can't be tested in court, etc. And then we have like Stephen Miller, who honestly, if you're looking at this cartoon, you see those images of a typical evil Nazi. Well, you can just put him right in there. He could be one of the portraits on the wall there. Um, you know, and he's like, this guy's an El Salvadoran citizen, and he's in El Salvador, so it's absolutely nothing to do with us. And it's like, well, you flew him there, and you have abrogated his rights in your own country, and unless you're saying he doesn't have freedom of movement, then there is no reason why the El Salvadoran government should stop you from repatriating him. But, there's a lot of this sort of false reasoning that is meant to appeal to people who basically is just giving them a way of being racist and callous and sadistic, And that is a big part of this. They want to see people suffer. I I was on like 10200 not that long ago, a podcast, 10200 podcast with Kyle Church. And I mentioned the lack of empathy towards migrants and asylum seekers as a sign of fascism, and it just, I didn't even think anything of saying it at the time, but honestly, it was just before all this sort of thing started, and the gleeful sadism which they're displaying, well, which I see. I mean, I think if you look for it, it's not that hard to see in what they say, the kind of self-righteous aggression. You know, if you actually strip away the ideology which they claim is behind it and the excuses, what you see, I think, is the real thing, and that is people who want to see others suffer, and it is a very much a racially informed thing. And this has been part of Trump's character for a long time. We've known this. We've known he's a racist. We've known he's a violent racist since he tried to bring back. He advocated bringing back capital punishment for the wrongly convicted Central Park Five. So this is, I think, part of an aspect of fascism, of Nazism, that we should be concerned about: the death of empathy and the rise of that sort of aggression, especially against the identified other. So obviously, Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem was an early kind of chink in the armour because it was talking about the banality of evil sort of thing, and looking at Adolf Eichmann and saying, well, this guy wasn't some strange creature. He was, he was an ordinary guy that became a Nazi. And there's also like when another story is that a psychiatrist was sent to study the major Nazi war criminals, and the one who was sent to study Goering was deeply shaken by the experience because he realised that Goering embodied everything he'd been told was virtuous. He was an intelligent, hard-working person, and that the things that stop you from being a Nazi had not been inculcated in him as virtues in his upbringing. And I mean, those sorts of things, the things that stop you from being a Nazi, are values that the right wing hate. If we're talking about the war on woke, which is currently in full swing in this country, I mean, it is in part a war against empathy, and a war against empathy is, a step towards fascism. So another book that I think kind of started, well, it's a bit later, so like I'm not doing these in chronological order by any means. Another book that kind of throws a doubt on Nazi exceptionalism was Mark Nazar's Hitler's Empire, which really shows a far less, well, definitely not a totalitarian society. It's dysfunctional, violent, nasty, horrible in all sorts of ways, but like far more pluralistic, and not like driven by fanaticism, and ideologically contingent as well. So it's sort of kind of like, I don't know, like Arendt's totalitarianism or Orwell's 1984, but also unlike it. This dual nature sort of thing. And I think that that's kind of an important thing as well, because what these things are depends on your standpoint. And this brings me to the next thing, the Nazi Terror by Eric Johnson that came out in 2000. He spent quite a long time looking into the Gestapo and found that their enforcement, the terror they reigned, was really only terror for certain people, particularly Jews, obviously, but ordinary German citizens, even when caught doing things such as listening to the BBC, which could theoretically attract the death penalty, would usually be like told, "Oh, that's a bit naughty," and let go. Gestapo wasn't really interested in a lot of that sort of thing, and that there was no terror for the ordinary people of Nazi Germany. Um, so, again, this kind of brings us back to Browning's ordinary men in a certain way, in that, like, they were ordinary men. They weren't terrorized into doing what they were doing, but they're ordinary men. But of course, the Nazi state wasn't that ordinary. But then it was. It's, again, like, the thing is that it's an awareness of something deniable. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And some people feel it and others don't. But then when it comes down to it, they kind of choose the fascist path, and it partly is out of fear. I've met quite a few people now who support Palestine, but actually are talking about how they are fearful in one way or another to go out on a protest. And it kind of like, it shocks me, quite frankly. It would never, we are so safe here in relative terms. But that's not how they feel at the moment. Some people, anyway. And in contrast to Browning, a very famous book came out by Daniel Goldhagen. It's called Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans in the Holocaust. So he refers to ordinary Germans, not ordinary men. And Goldhagen's book has sold many more copies. He's probably been featured in many more TV programs and so forth. In the popular consciousness, he's probably far more important than Christopher Browning. There's one problem with that. Historians hate the book. Raoul Herberg, who wrote the first massive, first proper history of the Holocaust, described it as totally wrong about everything and worthless. And this is kind of the part of the problem we have is the split. And it's not just about this subject either. It's the split between the popular scholarship, which is heavily promoted by an extremely right-wing media and publishing system, as well as a bunch of astroturfing and think tanks that will buy up thousands of books to get certain things into the bestseller list, so they can priming the pump so that they can get them to sell more widely by putting them already as a wide selling thing. But I think the distinction between Browning and Goldhagen actually is a continuation of a sort of this tension between those who look on Nazis and the Holocaust in an exceptional light, and those who see it as part of a continuity, part of human behaviour that we have to guard against. So I think it reflects the disagreements between Holocaust survivors like Primo Levi, who was very insistent that this was part of the human potential, and that there was no black and whites, that everyone existed in a continuum, that you couldn't, that the guards at Auschwitz weren't specifically monsters or specifically sadistic, etc., etc., etc. So this was he's very strongly associated with that viewpoint. And then there are exceptionalists like Elie Wiesel. And Wiesel, who wrote a book called Night, which I believe was first, is now considered an autobiographical novel because it's very fictionalized. He met Primo Levi, and Levi, he had claimed to have been Primo Levi, as a good friend in Auschwitz, and Levi didn't even recognize him. And in Norman Finkelstein's book, The Holocaust Industry, there is a lot of space devoted to ridiculing Wiesel as the guy was, he was a Holocaust survivor, but um, uh, Finkelstein pretty much hates him, and for making things up, for distorting the truth, for profiteering, and for using that profiteering to support Zionism and so forth. And one person who was a great fan of Elie Wiesel, he was a guy who went in the 1980s to Menachem Begin, who I've already mentioned, to say he didn't support Ronald Reagan in calling what the Israelis were doing in Lebanon a Holocaust, and he thought they should go even further. And this fan of Elie Wiesel was a guy called Joseph Biden, who would later have a successful political career in the US. Anyway, so going back to the Goldhagen thesis, which is what some people refer to it as, this Goldhagen thesis from the book by Hitler's Willing Executioners, is that Germans were possessed of an exterminationist anti-Semitism. And that's why they did this, because they had this thing inside them that they needed to get out. Now, this plays into older Jewish tropes about Gentiles hating Jews, which had become supercharged under Zionism. And now Germany officially says that all anti-Semitism is exterminationist at root. So it's not like racism or prejudice in any other form. Like all anti-Semites. There's quite a lot of irony around this, but all anti-Semites basically want to exterminate Jews. One of the things, if you study much about the Shoah, is that I guess one of the things that validates the non-exceptionalist arguments is that people who weren't anti-Semites were often very crucial, very enthusiastic murderers of Jews. While some anti-Semites actually rescued Jews because they didn't believe in exterminating them, but they held anti-Semitic beliefs. So this exterminationist idea is just fucking nonsense, right through and through. It's completely fucking stupid. But it's very useful for Zionist purposes. So now, of course, this is the reason given for why the October the 7th, the Al-Aqsa flood operation was genocide, not genocide in the legal sense of something, which I guess you could argue that they could be seeking to destroy in whole or in part the Israeli people as such. But no, that's not what they're arguing, because they don't want that version of genocide to even exist. What they're arguing is that October the 7th was an attempt to exterminate all of the Jewish people in Israel, which is quite a stretch, but that is actually what they say. So, and the logic is that the anti-Semitism is exterminationist. So, by definition, again, using definitions and words to craft your political reality. By definition, this was genocide, and proper genocide, not some fake genocide that the ICJ might say that Israel's doing. Anyway, in a way, I have to say though, to be fair to Goldhagen, he was rejecting Nazi exceptionalism for German exceptionalism and anti-Semitism exceptionalism, which is way more useful to the state of Israel, of course. But the effect of decontextualizing Nazi racism, or one particular form of Nazi racism from other forms of racism, is the same regardless. Because it becomes a fetish, really, it's like the palingenesis argument. Like if you say that is the key thing, and without that none of this happens, then you just have to create a new Nazism where that is either not the case or it is concealed, and then no one will ever call you a Nazi because it's categorically impossible because of the way you've created the categories. So that means, of course, that in reality you can become very Nazistisch without having any animus towards Jewish people at all. So another example of this sort of fetishization, friend of the pod Friedrich Hayek emphasized legal positivism as being a part of totalitarianism. So legal positivism is the kind of thing that comes out of European jurisprudence, unlike the English, the tradition of common law tradition. And it turns out that that's completely fucking wrong. So in Hitler's American Model by James Whitman, he discusses how in formulating the Nuremberg laws, the German jurists were extremely, well, they referred mostly to US racial laws, anti-miscegenation laws, and so forth. So one of the things that they really loved, and it was kind of maybe a little bit of a mind-blowing moment for Germans to sort of see this, was that they realized that under this sort of way of doing things, you did not have to define a race in order to persecute them. So there needed to be no scientific definition of what the race was, because judges just knew. So, in fact, the lack of legal positivism was a boon for them. I mean, top Nazis knew there was no such thing as a Jewish race in the scientific sense. Um, so it was kind of like, oh wow, we can pass laws without defining something. So they were like keen on this kind of non-categorical way of thinking as well. So there are no rules with that sort of thing. Obviously, it's all about really controlling the way reality is viewed. Not. I mean, sometimes it's useful to use that sort of reductionist categorical thinking, but other times the fuzzy logic is way more useful, as it turned out. And Hitler was, I mean, he was, for whatever else you call him, he was a bit of a free thinker. And even though he was a eugenicist and he was a racist, he didn't think Jews were a race in the sense of a genetic race. He saw them as an ethnicity or a sort of Volkish thing, like an entity. He called them a community of spirit in a letter to Martin Bormann. So, in a way, the blood part of blood and soil was not something that the top levels took literally. It's more a way of explaining things to people lower down and mobilizing them for your cause. If people had actually kind of been more attentive to that, then they'd kind of maybe take a different view of things like Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, because that seems to have gotten a free pass because it doesn't say we hate these races. It has this essentialized vision of civilizations and this need for struggle that is very fucking Nazi-like, and yet it was allowed to pass as very respectable. It still is. It's taught in universities. And as always, because of his stature as a scholar, um, you don't teach it by criticizing it. No matter how wrong-headed, dangerous, and quite frankly, fucking evil it is. I mean, we're talking about something that is in the context of masses of people dying. So it's also like a really obvious contributor to the fascistic discourse on migration. The idea that civilizations are these civilizational entities are opposed to each other, obviously fed into the great replacement theory and so forth. And we should actually go back a bit as well, because another thing that like the race laws that were discussed in Hitler's American model, are not the only inspiration for Nazi Germany. They also loved U.S. migration laws that were racially targeted. They began by stopping Asian immigrants, and we see, similar things in Australia to a certain extent. I mean, Aotearoa, other countries. I mean, where the economic conditions changed, but the US took it further and made these openly racial quotas. And again, obviously you can't define races because races don't actually exist in the real world. So they use that sort of fuzzy logic, and this is extremely interesting to Nazis. Was extremely interesting to Nazis, and it still seems to be, to tell the truth. So now we've got people talking about ethnostates and the network state. So we've got people like Patrice Friedman, who's the grandson of Milton Friedman, who I think was a very poorly concealed racist. I don't think he managed to hide it very well, but it still managed to pass. Anyway, but he and then people like Curtis Yarvin, who is kind of a philosophical inspiration for Peter Thiel and Vivek Ramaswamy, are taking these sorts of ideas, and it is very, I don't know, it's very Nazi-ish, I think. But they're really like almost logical extensions of the orthodoxies and the pieties of US exceptionalism that that are just normal for everyone. Like, they're only actually taking that logic to the next step, a bit like Trump saying that they should take over Gaza, I mean, that makes perfect sense if you believe everything that normal people believe about the US. And again, you've got this sort of doubling effect where people, like, they from depending on their standpoint, they either incorporate this into that belief or they don't. And they maybe actually have a little bit of, the sort of liberals opposing Trump may be suffering somewhat from what do you call it, cognitive dissonance, because of their rejection of something that actually doesn't is perfectly in concordance with their beliefs about the nature of their own society. So, and that's part of, like, I think that this sort of racism, the sort of Völkisch racism that top Nazis had, is very much the same as something very common in Western society, and it only got worse after World War II, and part of it was this defining the Western liberal self. So when you are defining the self, you're also defining the other. So all of those Western values, they all mean that the others aren't that. And we've seen this put into vicious effect in justifying the slaughter of people in third world countries. We are this, therefore they are that. And that is basically the same form of kind of non-genetic racism that the top Nazis believed in. And, the Nazis actually define themselves in ways we think that, you would think, well, they talk about themselves as muscular and strong and violent and that sort of thing. But in a lot of ways, they define themselves through what we would recognize as Western liberal beliefs. So, for example, the 1935 Nuremberg rally was called the Party Rally for Freedom. We might view that as an ironic thing, because it was. I mean, the 1939 rally was called the Rally for Peace. I mean, but is that? I mean, you can't seriously think that we're not also capable of that sort of ironic or duplicitous use of language to say the opposite of what we really mean. Would be, I mean, I think is probably pretty symptomatic of our current politics. And another one of the books that sort of started to early books that kind of put a chink in the armor of Nazi exceptionalism was written by Milton Mayer in 1955, and was like kind of an oral history of people in the Nazi Party. It was called "They Thought They Were Free," and they did. As I said, like for Hitler made as sure as he could that the experience for ordinary Germans was not one of oppression. So, I mean, it was. I mean, the oppression was there, but again, like, you could switch it. Your standpoint meant a lot, but also you have this double consciousness. Uh, so, in contrast, the way the Nazis defined Jews was to be kind of the opposite of them. Um, Ironically, the way we've defined Nazis in a way, you know. So, uh, and this kind of brings us back to this kind of subjectivity and definitions thing. So, like I mentioned that we liberalism is defined by its ideals, not its reality. And something I've mentioned in the past was Karl Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And it's a good book if you want to read about the enemies of the open society. But the open society itself, as he describes, has nothing to do with reality. He's talking about ideals and not about the way liberalism actually runs societies. So there is no, while he thinks he's created this great barrier between himself and, and us and the Nazis. I mean, it's kind of like putting a wall between, or a defensive line between France and Germany, and letting them go through Belgium, because the reality is the Nazis, you're just ignoring the commonalities, and by ignoring them, you leave the road open to becoming them. Ignoring the commonalities, you leave the road open to becoming Nazi. I mean, and this is, I think, extremely clear in the way Westerners talk about Islam. And it's no coincidence that, like so many, especially in Israel, compare compare Muslims to Nazis all the time. Again, that's not because of anything they've done. It's because we define them as the opposite to ourselves, and so this is what happens. Now, why is it not about anything they've done? Well, I would say that, of course, there are Muslim people who commit extremely violent acts, and there are Muslim people who say very bad fascistic things. It's just that if you actually drill down into the figures of who's killing whom, it's not even close. I mean, the number of Muslims killed by enlightened Western liberal Judeo-Christian nations is far in excess of the other way around, and likewise the number of Muslims killed by Jewish people is far, far in excess of the other way around. So yes, you can create abstracts and you can cherry pick people's speech to say that certain people have genocidal intentionality, but then um, basically you're ignoring people's actions and the facts on the ground again in order to create this worldview that is impervious to evidence. I met a, a Jewish couple in their mid 80s. They were very lovely people, but one of them, in particular, unprompted, and I didn't say, "Oh, I'm a pro-Palestine activist" or anything like that. They lived in Israel, and at some point in their lives, anyway. And so, I wasn't going to say that, but one of them, unprompted, started talking about how evil Islam was. And I was like, oh. But then they also went on to define Judaism in this really ridiculously specific way and say this is why Judaism can't ever be bad, is because Jews believe this. And it was like it was the experience they'd had going to a London synagogue and the sort of acceptance and this universality that they'd found. And it's like, well, I mean, we can all do that. We can all, I mean, you see every time, like, it goes back to the Rob Corddry thing mentioned by Adam Jones. You're talking about what people say they are, not what they actually do. So anyone can do that for any fucking thing, you know? It's just self-serving. Um, and it, you take it, if it takes hold of a society, it leads people to think that they can't do any wrong. And then suddenly their acts of killing children become, well, why do I keep mentioning killing children? Sorry, this is this is a bit of a cheat in a way. I mention killing children and I use it myself when I study things. I use it because it's an easy, nobody thinks, nobody can justify killing children. Like genocide, it's like it is totally unjustifiable. So it's often a marker, you know, that you can use to see when people cross that line, you know that there's something going on. All right. And I'm not saying that they need to cross that line for something to be going on, but I'm saying that it's useful to look at the discourses that surround acts of killing children. And it tells you something about what people are doing and why they're doing it. So in this case, once you're like, we can do no wrong, which exceptionalists all around the world do all the time based on their creation of their vision of themselves, which again, reiterating, is a creation of a racist idea of the other, then of course you start justifying killing children. So I have to say, if Israel has reached stage 5 Nazistisch, which I think, more or less, I mean, more resistance than there was in Germany, that's for sure. People openly speaking out about some things, they do exist in Israel. But as for that 80%, well, it's not looking good. Let's put it that way. But if they are there, the Western world isn't that far behind. So at some stage, after I've done all the other things I need to write, I want to talk about like how we have like these stages of fascism, and like right after World War II, there was a stage where it became fine to go and slaughter people in other countries because you're fighting against communism. So it was kind of a foreign policy stage, and then in the 1980s, it became fine to inflict great suffering on your own populace because the ideology of free market economics meant you had to. And now we're kind of reaching a point where they're starting to say people who are different, who are part of your society, it's okay to to do horrible things to them because you need to keep your society clean. And that is pretty fucking late stage Nazi stiche. And if I think we all can recognise that discourse, those sorts of ideas are in the political water we are drinking at the moment. So anyway, is any of this different? Were the Nazis exceptional? Are we exceptional? What's happening? How do we distinguish this from other shitty things that people have done in the past? And again, like it's a bit of a standpoint thing. If you were being carpet bombed, or if at the beginning of the Korean War, there was what was called the Bodo League massacres, where all these people who'd been registered on as a leftist were killed en masse, executed en masse, and estimates range up to 300,000 people killed in mass executions, rounded up and then executed, with US officers often overseeing this. So it was committed by South Korean troops under US, who were under broader US command anyway, but under sometimes fairly direct US control. Now, why the fuck would anyone who is a victim of that feel any differently about those US officers than they would about a Nazi? I mean, it's really difficult to argue that then, this is 1950, that the US was that different from the Nazis. But there are differences at home. Again, maybe arguably, especially from, an African American perspective or an indigenous perspective, maybe not that much. Aimé Césaire, in Discourse on Colonialism, argued that Nazism was just colonialism practiced in Europe. And quote, they tolerated Nazism before it was inflicted on them because until then it had applied to non-European peoples. And again, like there are a lot of examples of horrors inflicted on the world that are, you wonder what the purpose is of those who argue for Nazi exceptionalism. What are they saying? Are they saying, oh, it's all right, you can't, Anyway, it's rather like those who argue to police the term genocide. Although, I mean, it might have more of an intellectual basis than that, in that Nazis were Nazis and other people kind of by definition aren't really Nazis unless, it's a specific philosophy. And I'm here using them as an analogy for how Nazi-like or Nazi-stiche we're becoming rather than saying that people are literal Nazis. But still, why do people argue so hard that horrible things can't be labelled something else? It's an interesting question. But I think there is a certain, it's not entirely clear-cut. There's a cliche in genocide studies that all genocides are unique, but the Holocaust was uniquely unique, by which I think they mean the Shoah, not, but, again, like you drill down into it, it kind of becomes hard. So I think the thing that distinguishes Nazi genocide is potentially the gas chambers, the level of industrialization. But the gas chambers weren't used only on Jews. Hundreds of thousands of other people died in gas chambers. And most Jews who were killed by the Germans didn't die in gas chambers. From memory, I think about 1 million Jews died in gas chambers, and 5 million were killed with other methods, often looking very much like the Bodo League massacres. So, what? It is difficult, and then it gets even more difficult if you are sort of specifically talking about the Shoah rather than the other genocidal acts. And when people do include other things, they tend to like maybe reference the Roma and Sinti peoples, the Jehovah's Witnesses, gay people, and so forth. But the largest number of victims of Nazi genocide were Slavs, particularly Russians, but also very large numbers of Poles, non-Jewish Poles. So, I think more, Poland had a very large Jewish population who were almost completely wiped out, about 3 million, but I think about 4 million non-Jewish Poles died because of Nazi genocidal policies, including a method of waging war that was innately genocidal. So, and as I've referred to before, of course, when Raphael Lemkin first described genocide, his number one reference was to the Polish people, not to the Jewish people. So yeah, there's kind of the grounds for exceptionalism are there, but they are unstable, and they are not as easily they are matters of degree rather than categorical substance. So the way we become like Nazis is through our kind of religious belief, really, in the religion of the West. And it means different things to different people. But again, I should point out that National Socialism meant different things to different people as well. It was a bit, as I said, more pluralistic than people give it credit for. In the West, it means liberalism to some, democracy, capitalism, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and to many people, it means whiteness. It means caucasity, I've seen people get angry for pointing out the racial implications of people's talk about the West, but who the fuck do they think the Western nations are? It's like almost the Western nations, whether they admit it or not, are almost defined by the number of how many Caucasian people are in them. So, including Israel. I mean, why does Israel get to be a Western nation? I mean, now they're busy trying to rewrite it and say, no, look at us, we're not that, as Western nations become more diverse, it's true, but there's still that Caucasian basis to their self-identity. And it leaves us open to becoming more Nazi-like, especially because the outright racists, can talk in terms of the West and Western values, and they can convey to each other a very racist idea and have all of these liberals, deluded fucking liberals, other fucking, the people who love Karl Popper or whatever, thinking they're talking about the open society. It's very dangerous. And, lots of people have died because of it. Lots of people died because Western nations can go over to other countries and kill people in large numbers and say we're doing it because we're good. We're the good guys. And now Zionism is kind of providing a road for people to lean in more to their right wing, their Nazi ideas, and become more Nazi than ever. In a recent book, The World After Gaza, by Pankaj Mishra, he has a chapter called Germany from anti-Semitism to philo-Semitism. He's talking about things like countries like Hungary, kind of adopting the Holocaust exceptionalism and the memorialization and the Zionist definition of anti-Semitism as including criticism of Israel, kind of as a part of the process of becoming part of the EU. So it's kind of almost like the part of the religious belief or the official faith of the EU is this philo-Semitic Zionist belief, right? And, if you think about what's going on in Europe, it explains a lot. And you have a lot of these countries like Hungary, which are dominated by people who've kind of got a pretty proven track record of being anti-Semitic, crushing pro-Palestine protesters and being incredibly fanatically supportive of Israel. Then, you look at the AfD as well in Germany, like they kind of being pro-Israel creates room for them to be more Nazi-like. So, this chapter, this is a good book anyway, but this chapter is a bit of a standout, and I'm just going to read from some of it because I can't really put it any better myself. German Health Minister Karl Lauterbach approvingly retweeted a video in which an English far-right agitator claims that the Nazis were more decent than Hamas. Watch and listen, Karen Prine, a deputy chair of the Christian Democratic Union and education minister for Schleswig-Holstein, also retweeted. This is great, Jan Fleischheimer, the former editor of Der Spiegel, wrote. Really great, echoed Veronica Grimm, a member of the German Council of Economic Experts. In June 2024, as the number of Palestinians killed by Israel ran close to 40,000 women and children, with women and children comprising more than 2/3 of the identified dead, Germany's Nobel laureate Herta Müller, whose father served in the Waffen-SS in Romania, was still comparing Hamas to the Nazis and accusing American students of endorsing anti-Semitic violence. Die Welt claimed Free Palestine as the new Heil Hitler, and Die Zeit alerted German readers to the evidently outrageous fact that Greta Thunberg is openly sympathizes with the Palestinians. And it goes on, and then reaches like skipping forward a bit. State-funded cultural institutions have long penalised artists and intellectuals of non-Western ancestry who show any hint of sympathy for Palestinians, retracting awards and invitations. The German authorities have now turned to disciplining even Jewish writers, artists and activists. After October the 7th, Candice Bright's Deborah Feldman, Marcia Gessen, Nancy Fraser joined those either cancelled or lectured, as I.L. Weizmann put it, quote, by children and grandchildren of the perpetrators who murdered our families and who now dare tell us that we are anti-Semitic. So that is, that's the state of things in Germany. And of course, as this book documents very well, the Germans are very much part of this Holocaust exceptionalism thing. They spend a lot of time acknowledging their guilt over what happened to the Jewish people. They do not acknowledge any guilt over what happened to the Herero and Nama people and other colonial atrocities they've committed. And I would argue that the 20 million Russian civilians died under an explicitly genocidal strategy conducted by the Germans, and I don't see them. Well, what I see them doing is being very racist about Russians, and I wonder when the apology is coming for those people. So, yeah. We in the West kill a lot of kids. Our governments do. And the people who are in charge of it are not treated as child murderers, especially in the US. Like ordinary soldiers in places like in Korea or Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq may or may not commit atrocities. Some do, some don't. And they usually aren't going to face any sort of condemnation if they do. But the people who make the plans, who give the orders, the people higher up, they all commit atrocities. And none of them are free of guilt. None of them are free of enormous amounts of blood on their hands. They might rationalize it as being in a good cause, but who doesn't? I mean, the Nazis did as well. It is not a test for whether something is allowable. So a lot of the most prolific Nazi murderers never got their hands dirty. And obviously we have the example of Eichmann here. I'd have to say, though, Eichmann is a little bit unusual because he was caught, punished, and became a kind of an exemplar of this, whereas most of them, that didn't happen. And in fact, like even the people who are high up would claim that they were following orders and at the same time say that they weren't guilty because they didn't do anything with their own hands. So in Nazi terror, like the author identifies a couple of crucial Gestapo leaders who acted in ways that got a lot of Jewish people killed. That each of them was guilty of murdering hundreds, maybe thousands. And one of them got a few months in prison, and the other one was not prosecuted after having a campaign by allies to prevent them from being prosecuted. And they used that sort of defence. It was like, I got orders from on high. I passed them down to people below me. Yeah, you know, I didn't do anything wrong. And then like that, the same as the Eichmann defence, I didn't have any animus against these people. So therefore, because I didn't personally want them dead, therefore me actually making sure they ended up dead isn't actually really murder. Uh, yeah, so I mean, we can't. Again, if we're looking for fanaticism, we're looking for animus, hatred, frothing at the mouth. That is, we're looking in the wrong place. I mean, it's willingness to kill that is the problem. So, you know, I mean, part of the problem in Germany is, I mean, I mentioned Gunter Grass when I was talking about how how you don't have to be in a previous talk about how you don't need to be a specific fanatic person to be a Nazi. You can be an ordinary person and be a Nazi as he was. And he also Pankaj Mishra quotes him as saying that German history is like a blocked toilet that they keep trying to flush, but the shit keeps floating to the top. And part of that, in particular, in West Germany, in East Germany, the communist forces, like you need experts to run a country, so they put people from the Weimar Republic in charge, but in West Germany they just put the Nazis in charge. So we have unreconstructed Nazis. We have Theodor Adorno, went there and found there were no Nazis. He couldn't find any after the war because obviously it was just something that other people did, not us. We weren't real Nazis. And I feel that this is the same with us. Like if you watch someone like General Wesley Clark, who was in charge of the NATO bombing campaign against Serbia in 1999, honestly, you'd think he was. I mean, the guy probably sleeps extremely soundly at night, and none of his values are about committing the sort of crimes he actually did commit. It was all mistakes. He didn't mean to, or necessity, or blah 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 blah. It's like, but you took the fucking job, you prick. I mean, you actually killed innocent people. But instead, he gets lauded by everyone, including people on the left, because he, says, "Oh, I think this war thing has gone too far." And put him back in the same situation, he'd do the same fucking thing again. Anyway, so I mean, I think part of what I'm saying is that Aimé Césaire was right in a lot of ways, but not in every way. The Nazi Holocaust was exceptional in terms of scale and speed. It was inspired by Western imperialism. It was Hitler often referenced the genocidal actions against indigenous people in the United States or Canada. He clearly saw that as a model, and he was just trying to implement that in Europe. He was doing it on a more industrial scale with higher technology, and it happened much faster, but that was what he was trying to do. How much, I mean, maybe I think that it allowed for a more serious exterminationist underpinning in terms of the final solution becoming an actual policy. But other than that, I don't know that it was that qualitatively different. So this is also true of what's happening in Gaza. I mean, it seems, I mean, it's kind of, it is different, and in ways that are not just about the way that it's documented. It is a different intensity than what we have been used to in recent years. Uh, but we are, like we are repeating behaviors, and we need to look at the fundamental underpinnings to end them. To prohibit them, you can't keep making uh, making claims about the other and looking for the wrongdoing in the other. You need to kind of start examining your own behaviour in order to end these sorts of things. So, like I mentioned Korea, and it was really just the beginning of these post-World War II genocides. And the US has been committing serial genocides in multiple countries under the name of, it was originally labelled as being part of the Cold War anti-communist thing, and then they switched with some difficulty to a war on terror paradigm. But the reality is that it is in service of empire. It is for imperial domination. So most of the time, the response to these slaughters has been nothing, very little, apart from that 10%. The 10% care about it, but occasionally they have roused some of the 80%. Now, so it kind of these things progress, and you're kind of reminded of Martin Niemöller's poem. First, they came for the communists, and I didn't care because I was a communist, etc., etc. And of course, this is like more problematic than I think people admit, because it implies self-interest, and it implies that they're going to come for you eventually. Whereas the ordinary Germans who kept their mouths shut, they weren't going to come for them. They came for Niemöller because he stood up against them. He was a resistor. So I think that it is wrong to try and say, in one sense, you need to stand against this or they will come for you. What you need to tell them is you need to stand against this or you are a fucking Nazi. Right? And it is bad. It's not for your benefit. It's not like you're going to live a happy life under this regime because you obey the government. The government fucking hates you as well. You're just a tool to them. You're a pawn. And they will make your life progressively worse and worse. But you aren't going to be put in a camp. That's all it means. And I think we already see that the kind of increasingly fascist governance is very much focused on the needs of those at the top, the desires of those at the top, and it will crush ordinary people under their heel to some extent anyway. So, I think that we need to reject the persecution of others for its own sake, not because we'll be next in a list. We need to reject the persecution of others because it is destroying part of us as humans, not individually, not taking us out individually, but destroying part of what, part of our whole personhood, making us into these hateful machines. So we're worried about fascist takeover, and obviously people have going right back to It Can't Happen Here by I can't remember his name, a leftist author who wrote in the 1930s, so quite early on. Begins with yes. Anyway, going right back that far, people have pointed out that Nazism, fascism, isn't going to come looking like Mussolini or Hitler. It will fit our circumstances, and in this, people are often maybe looking more to the excesses of some communist regimes in terms of trying to enforce ideological uniformity and transposing that onto fascism according to this idea that the two are somehow the same. So they're kind of maybe making themselves comfortable about our society when they ought not to. So what we're seeing now, though, it does seem to be quite radical in some ways. On Democracy Now! Recently, like the day before yesterday when I record this, Mahmoud Khalil's lawyer pointed out that this, obviously the actions against him violate the First Amendment, freedom of speech. And this is not the first time this has happened in the US history, right? So there's a book by Adam Hochschild called American Midnight about a kind of fascist moment between 1917 and 1921. Which is very much parallel to our own times in a lot of respects, and involved crackdown on freedom of speech and the deportation of lots of migrants, and of course the tightening up of immigration standards and the anti-migrant movement. And I think it's interesting, and again, I will maybe include this when I do get around to writing about Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. This extends from a place of foreign policy to begin with, as often things do. People who have a foreign policy agenda unleash certain ideologies at home that may take on a life of their own or may simply evolve to serve other purposes. But, like Mahmoud Khalil, as his lawyer was pointing out, First Amendment protects all speech, even unpopular and possibly insane things like suggesting that all red-headed people should be killed, or burning the US flag, or advocating the violent overthrow of the US government. These things have all been ruled as protected speech, and also the argument has been accepted by courts that non-citizens have to have their speech protected as well, because it's not just about your ability to say something, it's about your ability to hear something as well. So, you can't deport people for their speech. Not that it's stopped them now or in the past. But Mahmoud Khalil was not saying something controversial. He was asking for divestment from Israeli settlements. And what he was saying was something that the majority of the population supports. Not just the majority of the population, but the laws. The Leahy Law, the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime and Genocide, the ICJ rulings, which oblige everyone to take action to try and end the Israel's genocidal acts. And since the ICJ later ordered an outright ceasefire, sending weapons to Israel, for example, is a blatant violation there of the orders of the highest court in the world. So this guy, he's not being persecuted for some outside belief. He's being persecuted for saying what is understood by the majority and by the authorities, the appropriate authorities, intellectual authorities, I mean, not political authorities. So it is very radical in that sense, as is the open display of radically unempathetic behaviour towards the Kilmar. I've forgotten the rest of his name. The guy who had protected status, who was deported to El Salvador, taken to El Salvador, not deported, of course. He was rendered to El Salvador in an illegal action. So, these are very radical. One thing, though, is that I'm not sure that they can ever develop the sort of support for that sort of behaviour that the Nazis managed to get from German people at the height of their power. And what we're seeing may actually be the end of, the beginning of the end of this sort of fascism, because it's unsustainable. I would hope so anyway, because this fascist pivot, it is obvious, and it doesn't have the sort of mass backing that the Nazis had. I mean, we have lived with this kind of fascism for thee, liberalism for me, Western culture of doubling, where we accept oppression of the other for so long. Now it's kind of like, now we're face to face with it happening in our own countries. We don't have I don't think we have the equipment to say, oh, this is all right, it's only the immigrants, because that's not the idea. I mean, there's a movement, liberalism. Obviously, I don't like it as a political movement, but liberal ideas I like. Where liberalism falls down is that it's often so fucking illiberal, However, there are core liberal ideas that are kind of embedded after such a long time of liberal governance, and I don't think that I'll necessarily be able to get rid of them. But how, again, is it that way, or is it that those people I meet who are pro-Palestine, who are scared to go out, represent more of the population than I think? Will we be the Nazis actually start going along with things and then rewrite history afterwards when it all ends and say, no, we hated it, we didn't like it. There are no Nazis here, you know. The and again, it is really kind of just an extension of the existing ideas that people have accepted of Western exceptionalism, of US militarism, of the the acceptability of saying that the lives of others are not as worthy as our own, and that we will accept the killing of others because they are not Westerners and therefore of less concern to us, and therefore it can be done, without us being the Nazis. It's just it's difficult to say where this is going. Of course, the thing is that part of Trump's pivot is to try and change the soft power version of fascism, this indirect control, which I think is starting to fray at the edges, into a more of a direct control, to build what Alfred McCoy recently called Fortress America, to this talk of annexing Canada and Greenland. How much of this is going to happen, I don't know. But one of the things about Trump is that he puts things out there and gets them embedded. He's very good at that. He gets them embedded within a certain minority so that they become an ever more considerable, aspects. And so going forward, the things he say that are completely fringe at the moment become more and more part of the mainstream as time goes on. So yeah, the basic answer is that we got to reject it all. We have to learn what it is first and reject it all. Start looking for the Nazi within and expunge that person. But try to encourage people to grow a spine, as well. I think that even though it's not about them, they'll come for me. I think that Niemöller was onto something in that, people's unwillingness to stand up was what allowed things to go as far as they did. And they won't come for you to put you in a camp, but your country will turn into a slave society, and you'll be one of the slaves. Anyway, so I'll go through some of the things I mentioned in terms of reading, just to remind you. So we had Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men from 1992, quite seminal. The Nazi Terror by Eric Johnson. So this is a guy who wanted to write a little short book about the way normal policing happened under the Nazis, and found out there was no normal policing under the Nazis. So ended up spending 10 years writing a book about the Gestapo. So another book I recommend is The Holocaust and Strategic Bombing by Eric Marcuse and David Kopf. Now, why I want to recommend this, and I've written about it in other places and probably mentioned it in a few other places, is because it does a parallel history of the genocidal policies of the Germans and the strategic bombing policies of the Allies. And they do not at any stage say that there's a morally equivalent or anything like that, but the fact is, if you read it and you see the way their thinking goes along such similar lines, it is absolutely chilling. And what I would say is that, especially because uh, nuclear weapons were developed and used during World War II, that the line between the two is paper thin. It's circumstantial rather than ideological. And that, I think, should frighten us all. So another book which kind of shows another parallel like that is John Dower's War Without Mercy about the Pacific War, where it shows the genocidal ideologies adopted by the US fighting the Japanese and adopted by the Japanese in their view of white people as well. You know, because just because the Western nations are the main doers of genocide at the moment, that certainly doesn't mean that you can't do it while not having white skin. It's not exclusive to us, and it's not. We shouldn't develop any sort of other exceptionalist ideas. So yeah, also Pankaj Mishra's book here, just awesome book. So I got this thinking I needed to read it in order to write about something else, and it turns out that he also can't really talk about Gaza without spending a lot of time talking about Nazis. So it turned out to be way more pertinent to this than what I thought it was going to be pertinent to. So Mark Mazauer's Hitler's Empire I talked about as well. It's a very good book. It's quite it's quite comprehensive, so I can't really summarize it that well. Hitler's American Model by James Whitman was the thing where he's talking about the inspiration that the Germans derived from the racial laws in the US, applied to being used as to model the Nuremberg laws. Now, I think I've discussed it a reasonable amount. One thing, though, that the book does mention quite a lot Hitler's inspiration from the history of genocide imperial genocide in North America, how much he viewed himself as trying to emulate that model. It's certainly covered in the book, but one of the things not covered in the book is actually another legal thing, which is that first racial pass laws actually came out of California in the 1850s. And so they also obviously doesn't show up as much in the documentation by the Nazis, but they're also like another form of direct inspiration for Nazi genocide policies was that. And in fact, a book where you can read about that is Benjamin Madley's An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, which came out in 2017. So the past laws were basically, it was required. There were death squads acting in California who would be paid bounties for scalps. So this was triggered in part by the gold rush and other sudden needs to acquire land and so forth, like a massive expansionary push that made the sort of more sporadic levels of, they kicked up the level of genocide beyond the normal that you would experience in most settler colonial societies, um, or indeed in the past of the US as they expanded. And so they sent these death squads out with bounties for scalps, and also passed these laws requiring that Indigenous people be employed and have employment papers, and that they weren't allowed to leave the place that they were employed. And if they were caught outside there, they could be punished or just killed out of hand. And since you sent out bounty hunters to do that, of course, that means that uh, anyone caught by them without a pass would be killed, and plenty of people probably who had passes would be killed as well. Yeah, so that's a very interesting book, um, and yeah, I think I've probably got that reasonably accurate. You can read it for yourself and see what mistakes I made from memory there. Right, so that is all I have to say on the matter. If you want to see what Education for Death sounds like with the sound on, then it's very easy to find online. So yeah, I will leave it there and catch you next time.